This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 17. We'll go 6 verses, then explain. Verse 1. The burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The cities of Aroer are forsaken. They will be for flocks, which shall lie down, and no one shall make them afraid. The fortress shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. They will be as the glory of the children of Israel, says Yahweh of armies. It will happen in that day that the glory of Jacob will be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh will become lean. It will be like when the harvester gathers the wheat, and his arm reaps the grain. Yes, it will be like when one gleans grain in the valley of Rephaim. Yet gleanings will be left there like the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 olives in the top of the uppermost bough, 4 or 5 in the outermost branches of a fruitful tree, says Yahweh, the God of Israel. Comment, the last 2 chapters were a prophecy of what would happen in Moab when the Assyrian Empire invades. Now this chapter is what will happen when the Assyrians invade other countries, namely Syria, the northern kingdom of Israel, and the kingdoms of the Transjordan. There will be terror and devastation similar to what will take place in Moab. We know from history that the Assyrians came from the north and conquered all the way down to and including Egypt, but miraculously God spared Judah, 2 Kings 19. In verse 1, Damascus is the major city of Syria, about 140 miles north of Jerusalem. It will be a ruinous heap. In verse 2, the cities of the Transjordan will be wiped out. The cities of Aroer, they're called. Sheep will graze where those cities once stood. In verse 3, the fortress shall cease from Ephraim. Ephraim's the heart of the northern kingdom, also called Israel, Jacob, and Samaria. Their fortified cities will be conquered, which means the whole land will fall. In verse 4, the glory of Jacob will be made thin. It turned out the Assyrians deported most of the population to Mesopotamia and beyond, 2 Kings 17:6. Thus it was a thinning of Jacob, as verse 4 says. How thin will Jacob be? In verse 5, when the reapers go through a field, they get maybe 99%. The remaining of Israel will be as sparse as what's left over after the reaping of a field. An almost insignificant portion of the population will remain. In verse 6, after an olive tree is harvested, 2 or 3 olives are left in the top and 4 or 5 in the outermost branches. Those few olives remaining represent the few remaining Israelites. The vast majority will be starved during the 3 years of sieges, or killed by the sword, or deported, 2 Kings 17:5 and 6. Ever since verse 3, the focus has been on the northern kingdom, still regarding the people of that kingdom, verse 7. In that day people will look to their Maker, and their eyes will have respect for the Holy One of Israel. They will not look to the altars, the work of their hands, neither shall they respect that which their fingers have made, either the Asherah poles or the incense altars. In that day their strong cities will be like the forsaken places in the woods and on the mountain top, which were forsaken from before the children of Israel, and it will be a desolation. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and have not remembered the rock of your strength. Therefore you plant pleasant plants, and set out foreign seedlings. In the day of your planting you hedge it in. In the morning you make your seed blossom, but the harvest flees away in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. Comment in verse 7, the small remnant of people in the northern kingdom will look to their Maker and have respect for him in those days. But what are those days? Probably the same as in verse 9, the days when their cities are forsaken and as depopulated as woods and mountaintops. So it's survivors we're talking about who weren't deported. After the dust settles, those few who remain will think about what happened and turn back to Yahweh. In verse 8, they won't look to their foreign gods and idols as they did before. But in verses 10 and 11, while this prophecy is being delivered, which is pre-invasion, the Israelites aren't worried so much. They garden and set out exotic plants, expecting to eat rare and unusual delicacies, but little do they know the harvest will flee away in the day of grief and desperate sorrow. Concerning the many nations of the area, verse 12, the uproar of many peoples who roar like the roaring of the seas, and the rushing of nations that rush like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations will rush like the rushing of many waters, but he'll rebuke them, and they'll flee far off, and will be chased like the chaff of the mountains before the wind, and like the whirling dust before the storm. At evening, behold, terror. Before the morning, they are no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us, and the lot of those who rob us. Comment in verses 12 to 14, many peoples will be in an uproar like the roaring of the sea and the rushing of mighty water, which means the Assyrian invasion of the area will be overwhelming like breakers crashing on the beach or the rushing of a mighty river. It'll be the rebuke of God against those many nations in verse 13. The people of those countries will flee the invasion like chaff or dust blown in a strong wind. In verse 14, it'll be terror in the evening, and by morning they are no more. Of the surrounding nations, only Judah will be able to resist the Assyrian army, and only by a total miracle as recorded in 1 Kings 19, when God killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers overnight as they slept in their tents. In verse 14, the portion of those who plunder and rob us. This refers to Syria and Israel plundering Judah, 2 Chronicles 28, 5-9. In response, God will bring in the Assyrians to plunder the plunderers, so Syria and Israel's portion from God is to be plundered as they plundered Judah. But in the case of Israel, the main reason God plundered them was because of idolatry, 2 Kings 17, 7-23. Of the 613 laws of Moses, Israel didn't even keep the first and most basic, which was, "You shall have no other gods before me," Exodus 20, verse 3. Isaiah 18 is next.